I think my mother did exactly the right thing. I think it's absolutely extraordinary.
The ceremony was supposed to celebrate continuity, family, and the quiet dignity of the crown. Instead, one sentence brought Balmoral to a standstill. Queen Camilla made a remark about Princess Anne's place beside the king. Anne went completely silent, and Charles reacted before anyone else could recover. He ordered the portrait ceremony stopped. No photographs, no continuation, no polite attempt to pretend nothing had happened. And suddenly, everyone in that room understood this was personal. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles had entered the room expecting unity, not a family rupture. The Balmoral portrait ceremony was a private royal sitting arranged to create an official image of the senior family around the monarch, while the crown meant the institution of monarchy itself. Camilla, as queen, stood beside the sovereign, the reigning monarch, and Anne carried the title Princess Royal, an honor traditionally granted to the sovereign's eldest daughter. Every position therefore carried meaning. Who stood near the king spoke about trust, service, and belonging. Camilla broke the tension during the final positioning. She looked toward Anne and said she should remember who stands beside the sovereign now. The words landed hard. Anne did not answer. She turned toward the queen consort, then toward her brother, and the silence became more disturbing than anger. This was a woman known for bluntness and immediate response. Yet now she gave Charles nothing except a stare that told him the remark had reached somewhere far deeper than ceremony. Charles reacted before anyone could smooth it over. He raised one hand toward the photographer. "Enough. We are stopping here." Camilla remained still, realizing the sentence had changed the room. Anne did not challenge her. She did not defend herself. That restraint made the moment worse, because the king knew there had already been disagreement that morning about the portrait arrangement and who should stand closest to him. The tension sharpened when an aide suggested a short break. Charles refused. He ordered that the portrait remain unfinished until he personally decided otherwise, turning an uncomfortable exchange into a royal intervention. The king was no longer calming tempers. He was freezing the event. Anne finally moved toward the door. Camilla watched her leave, while Charles stayed behind, torn between wife and sister. According to a documented account, later circulated among household staff, the princess quietly told one trusted aide, that was not about a photograph. Charles would soon discover exactly what she meant. To understand why one remark could stop a royal ceremony in seconds, the story had to move beyond the portrait itself and into the history between all three. Charles was not simply standing between two angry women. He was standing between two relationships that had defined completely different parts of his life. Camilla represented the partner he had fought decades to place beside him. Anne represented something older, childhood loyalty, duty without sentiment, and the sibling who had rarely demanded recognition. Now one sentence had forced the king to confront a truth every monarch fears: the private family wound that suddenly becomes inseparable from the crown. Charles found Anne away from the portrait room and asked to speak with her alone. Their bond had survived decades of pressure because she had rarely asked him for special treatment, and that mattered now. The Princess Royal, the traditional title given to the monarch's eldest daughter, had built her reputation around duty rather than ceremonial importance. She had stood beside the institution through family scandals, public criticism, and periods of uncertainty without demanding to become the center of attention. That was exactly why her silence frightened him. Anne listened as her brother said he had never expected Camilla to make the remark. She did not raise her voice. She answered that the problem was not whether he expected it. The problem was whether he understood what it revealed. Charles hesitated, and she immediately saw that he did not yet know the full story. That hesitation hurt more than anger would have. She had never wanted to compete with his wife. She wanted to know that decades of loyalty could not be quietly erased by a change in palace symbolism. Camilla waited elsewhere, growing more unsettled with every passing minute. Her position as queen carried public meaning because she stood beside the sovereign at major state and family occasions, making even small ceremonial choices appear politically loaded. When an aide told her Anne had already left the portrait wing, she stiffened. Then she asked the question that exposed her real fear. Had Charles gone after his sister? The answer was yes, and worse followed. A documented household account showed that Anne had objected to the portrait arrangement the previous evening, not because she wanted to stand closer to Charles, but because she believed another senior royal had been pushed too far from the central grouping. The king realized the argument had begun before the ceremony ever started. Charles then requested the original portrait placement notes. Camilla learned of that decision through a private briefing and understood immediately why it mattered. Those pages could show who changed the approved arrangement and when. Charles studied them in silence. One handwritten alteration had appeared after his approval. The portrait ceremony had not created the conflict, it had exposed it. And the change on that page led directly back to a Balmoral dinner everyone had tried to forget. 3 nights before the portrait was abandoned, there had been another silence at Balmoral. It happened around a private dinner table, away from photographers and ceremonial staff, when a seemingly minor discussion about royal precedents became unexpectedly sharp. Anne had challenged a proposed change. Camilla had refused to retreat. Charles had ended the conversation before it became an argument. But what nobody understood that evening was that the dispute had not ended at all. It had simply gone underground. Anne had already sensed that the portrait carried more weight than anyone wanted to admit. Royal precedence, the formal order that determines who stands, enters, or appears closest to the monarch, can look trivial from outside. Yet inside the family, it sends a powerful message about status and responsibility. The planned Balmoral portrait was meant to show a settled reign after years of disruption. She believed that meant recognizing service, not simply arranging everyone around personal closeness to Charles. That belief put her on a collision course with Camilla. Camilla finally said what had been building beneath the polite discussion. During the private dinner, she suggested that Anne no longer needed such a prominent position in official family imagery because the reign has its own center now. The Princess Royal slowly put down her fork. Then she looked directly across the table and answered, "Duty is not seasonal." Charles immediately cut in. He asked both women to leave the subject until morning, hoping to stop the tension before it became something harder to repair. Anne obeyed, but the damage had already been done. She heard something in her brother's intervention that unsettled her. He had stopped the argument, yet he had not challenged the idea behind Camilla's words. Charles believed he was creating space. His sister feared he was allowing a new hierarchy to harden around him. A recorded private conversation, later referenced by household staff, captured her concern that loyalty was being measured differently now that the monarchy had entered a new phase. The next morning made that fear real. Anne learned through an internal briefing that the portrait placement sheet had been changed. Her position had been moved farther from Charles, even though the king had never personally ordered it. She said nothing. Instead, she decided to wait and see whether her brother noticed the alteration himself before the ceremony began. Charles eventually compared the original plan with the amended version after stopping the portrait session. That was when the truth hit him. Anne had not simply been angry about placement. She had been testing whether years of loyalty still registered when nobody forced him to look. That realization changed everything. His anger was no longer aimed only at one remark. Now he wanted to know who had changed the plan, why it had happened, and whether Camilla understood what her words had set in motion. This time, he would ask her face to face. The confrontation does not happen in front of courtiers. Charles makes certain of that. He enters Camilla's private sitting room, closes the door himself, and places the altered portrait plan on the table between them. There is no shouting at first. That makes the moment more dangerous. He asks one question. Did she know Anne had been moved? Camilla studies the page, then looks back at him. What follows changes the argument completely. Charles knows he cannot enter this conversation only as a husband. He is also the sovereign, meaning the reigning head of the monarchy, and every decision made in his name carries weight beyond the family. If he accuses Camilla without proof, he risks damaging their marriage. If he ignores what happened, he risks telling Anne that loyalty can be pushed aside without consequence. The king taps the amended position on the page and asks whether his wife requested it. Camilla answers carefully at first. She admits she raised concerns about the composition, but insists she never told anyone to humiliate Anne or move her away from Charles. The queen consort says she wanted the portrait to make the king and queen appear more clearly at the center because the image was meant to represent the reign. Then, his voice hardens. He reminds her that the remark during the ceremony made the alteration look deliberate, whether that was her intention or not. Camilla finally breaks. She tells Charles she is tired of every attempt to assert her place being treated as an attack on someone else. He does not interrupt. She then reveals through a private conversation with him that she had asked the household team whether the central grouping could be strengthened around the monarch and his wife. She never named Anne. She never ordered a demotion. But the request had been strong enough for someone else to interpret what she wanted and act without asking further. Charles lets the silence sit before delivering the details she does not expect. Anne already knew she had been moved before entering the portrait room. Camilla stares at him. The Princess Royal had said nothing because she wanted to see whether anyone would notice the imbalance without being forced to confront it. Suddenly, the ceremony looks less like a spontaneous explosion and more like a painful test that everyone failed. Charles does not defend either woman. He picks up the altered plan and tells Camilla he will find out exactly who authorized the final change. She realizes the question is no longer about one remark or one wounded relationship. Someone had turned a private preference into an official decision. And now the king was about to discover how quietly palace influence could become palace power. Royal power rarely announces itself with raised voices. Sometimes it appears as a pencil mark on a seating plan, a rewritten briefing note, or a quiet instruction passed between offices. Charles now wants to know exactly how Anne's position changed after his approval. But the deeper he looks, the more uncomfortable the answer becomes. Nobody forged an order. Nobody openly defied the king. Instead, several people made small assumptions, and together, those assumptions changed the picture. Charles begins tracing the decision through the palace chain. A ceremonial plan is simply the working arrangement used to organize positions, timing, and precedence for an official royal event, but those pages can pass through several offices before anything becomes final. That matters because the crown depends on delegated judgment. Senior aides are expected to interpret preferences quickly, yet the same system can turn a suggestion into something that feels like an instruction before anyone stops to ask who actually authorized it. Charles reads annotation after annotation in a private working room. He removes his glasses and sets them beside the papers without speaking. The answer is becoming clearer, and he does not like it. No single person had written, "Move Anne." No explicit command existed. Instead, one request had been repeated, softened, interpreted, then translated into action. The king realizes that his sister had been displaced, without anyone believing they were personally responsible for doing it. Anne receives word through an aide that her brother is reviewing the entire process. She does not celebrate. She grows quieter. The Princess Royal says she never wanted an inquiry, and never wanted staff dragged into a family dispute. What she wanted was simpler and more painful. She wanted Charles to recognize why the change mattered, before paperwork was required to prove it. Her sadness cuts deeper, because the king now understands she had been asking for recognition, not rank. Charles finally reaches the decisive note. A documented household briefing traces the alteration to a senior coordinator who interpreted Camilla's request for stronger emphasis on the Queen as permission to shift Anne away from the central grouping. The Queen consort had not personally ordered the move, but her words carried enough weight that others anticipated what they believed she wanted. Charles sees the real problem immediately. Camilla may not hold procedural responsibility, yet the moral responsibility is harder to dismiss. Her preference created pressure. Anne felt the result, and the king allowed the machinery around him to make a deeply personal choice look routine. By morning, the question is no longer who moved Anne. Charles now faces something harder: whether the portrait ceremony should happen again at all, and whether Camilla and his sister can stand together without reopening everything Balmoral has just exposed. The next morning, the unfinished portrait becomes more powerful than any completed photograph could have been. The room has been reset, the equipment removed, and the planned image is gone. Yet nobody at Balmoral can behave as though nothing happened. Charles has made no announcement about restarting it. Anne keeps her distance. Camilla realizes that even without a public statement, the king's decision has already changed the atmosphere around her. Silence has become the consequence. Charles makes the suspension formal. The portrait schedule, a planned timetable for when official royal photographs are taken, is not delayed for a few hours, but removed from the immediate calendar altogether. That matters, because the image had been intended to project stability at a moment when the family wanted to show unity around the reign. Household staff are quietly told not to discuss the disagreement, yet cancelled appointments and altered communications make the rupture harder to hide. The king has stopped the machinery of normality until something deeper is repaired. Camilla feels that reality at breakfast. She sits without Anne, reaches toward her tea, then pauses when an aide enters. The Queen consort asks whether the Princess Royal has already left the main house. When told she has gone out with Charles, she says nothing for several seconds. The absence feels deliberate now. She had believed the argument could be explained. Instead, she is beginning to understand that the damage rests less in what she intended than in what Anne heard. Anne walks beside her brother, carrying no triumph at all. She tells Charles she does not want Camilla punished, removed, or publicly embarrassed. What hurts is the idea that decades of service can be shifted aside whenever ceremonial symbolism becomes inconvenient. The king listens differently this time. His sister is not asking for a better position in a photograph. She is asking whether loyalty still has meaning when nobody thinks to defend it. Charles then tells her what the internal review established. Camilla did not directly order the change. Anne surprises him by saying she already suspected that. A private recorded conversation, later summarized for household staff, makes her position clear. Her anger was never about proving who gave an instruction. It was about the culture that made moving her seem reasonable in the first place. Charles finally admits why he stopped the ceremony. Camilla's remark forced him to hear what Anne had refused to say aloud, that she felt valued when duty was difficult, yet expendable when symbolism became important. The confession changes something between them. Anne gives him one answer: no aides, no schedules, no ceremony. She wants to speak to Camilla directly, and for the first time since Balmoral fractured, neither woman will have palace machinery standing between them. There is no photographer this time, no equerry, no secretary standing near the door. Anne enters the small Balmoral sitting room alone, and Camilla is already waiting. For several seconds, neither woman speaks. The argument that stopped a royal ceremony has finally been reduced to its simplest form. Two people, one damaged relationship, and words that cannot be delegated to anyone else. Anne begins without anger. She tells Camilla exactly why that single remark left her unable to respond. Anne had asked for this meeting because she refused to let Charles become the permanent messenger between them. An equerry is a senior royal aide who helps organize official duties and personal arrangements, but no such buffer is present now. That matters because this conflict began when private feelings became ceremonial decisions. If there is going to be peace, she believes it must come directly from the two women who wounded each other. Camilla listens without interrupting. The household review had cleared her of deliberately ordering Anne's repositioning, yet the queen consort already understands that procedural innocence does not erase emotional damage. Anne tells her that hearing the words, "Who stands beside the sovereign now?" cut deeply, because she had never tried to occupy a wife's place. She had spent her life standing beside the institution whenever duty demanded sacrifice. To be treated as though that loyalty had suddenly become intrusive felt unbearable. Camilla finally answers. She admits the remark came from defensiveness, not calculation. The Queen says she had begun to feel that every objection to the portrait was another reminder that her own place beside Charles would always be viewed as conditional. Anne absorbs that quietly. For the first time, she sees that insecurity had been sitting beneath the Queen's anger, just as surely as hurt had been sitting beneath her own silence. Anne then reveals something Camilla does not expect. In a private recorded conversation later summarized in a household account, she admits she knew about the altered arrangement before entering the ceremony. She deliberately said nothing because she wanted to see whether anyone else would notice. Camilla is shaken. But the princess does not use the confession as a weapon. She says the test was unfair too. That admission changes everything. Both women had entered the ceremony expecting to be diminished, and both had interpreted every gesture through that fear. Camilla finally asks whether Anne would stand for the portrait again. She answers that the decision belongs to Charles, but if he restores the original arrangement, she will return. The poison is not gone, but it has lost its grip. Now the king must decide whether Balmoral buries the rupture quietly or turns the unfinished portrait into an unmistakable act of reconciliation. By the time Balmoral's private disagreement reaches the outside world, the portrait itself no longer matters. The cancellation is the story. Commentators seize on Charles's decision to stop the ceremony. Newspapers frame Anne's silence as a sign of something deeper, and crowds outside royal gates begin debating a family argument they never witnessed. Yet one image captures the public mood more powerfully than any headline. Anne arriving for duty the next morning, expression composed, saying nothing. Charles reads the first wave of coverage and immediately understands the danger. The palace has confirmed only that the Balmoral portrait session was interrupted and will be rescheduled, while refusing to discuss the private exchange behind it. A royal portrait session is an official photographic sitting, designed to project continuity and unity around the monarchy. So canceling one without explanation makes the absence itself symbolic. The king realizes silence is no longer protecting anyone. It is allowing everyone outside the family to decide what the silence means. Camilla feels that pressure almost instantly. She opens one especially harsh newspaper account, reads halfway through, then closes it without finishing. The queen consort is being presented as calculating and cruel, while Anne is increasingly portrayed as the injured symbol of old-fashioned duty. The Princess Royal is told about the coverage by her staff, but refuses to answer it. She says private reconciliation must not become public theater, and that choice only strengthens the public fascination with her restraint. The story explodes when a major London newspaper runs the words, "The portrait that never happened," across its front page beside Charles, Camilla, and Anne. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathers as broadcasters describe Balmoral as the clearest visible sign yet of tension inside the royal household. The palace gates become a focal point for speculation, and every silence from the family seems to feed another interpretation. Charles finally decides that another statement would only create more argument. Action has to answer action. He orders the Balmoral portrait ceremony reinstated using the original approved arrangement, the version created before Anne was moved. The decision matters because it does more than restore a position. It tells everyone inside the household that the king has chosen to correct the imbalance rather than disguise it. Camilla accepts the decision. Anne accepts it too. Neither woman demands another conversation. The new date is set quietly, and the family prepares to return to the same ceremony that had collapsed under the weight of one remark. But one final question remains. When Charles walks back into that room, where will the two women stand? The monarchy is returning to the place where the fracture became visible. And this time, the final arrangement will have to say what words no longer can. When the Balmoral portrait ceremony resumes, nobody enters the room unchanged. Charles knows what silence can conceal. Camilla understands how easily insecurity can become authority in the ears of others. Anne has learned that even loyalty can become a test when pain is left unspoken. There is no dramatic speech as they take their places. There does not need to be. The answer is visible in Charles's decision. The original arrangement has been restored, and Anne is standing exactly where she was meant to stand. Charles has deliberately returned to the first arrangement he personally approved. The portrait session, a formal sitting used to create an official royal image, now carries more meaning than it did before the crisis, because every position reflects a choice made after conflict. The king is making one principle unmistakable. Royal symbolism must recognize service and trust, not become a silent contest over who can stand closest to the sovereign. That matters for Anne, but it also matters for Camilla, because both women now understand how quickly symbolism can become personal. Charles approaches his sister before the photographer begins. He keeps the words simple. You should never have had to wonder. Anne does not answer with a speech, and she does not need to. She gives him a small nod. The tension that had grown between them since the altered arrangement finally begins to break, because the king has acknowledged the real injury. She was never asking to be favored. She was asking not to be forgotten. Camilla then takes her place. She looks toward Anne, and for a brief moment, neither woman hides behind rank or ceremony. The queen consort gives a small acknowledgement. The princess returns it. There is no sudden embrace, and no false suggestion that every wound has disappeared. What matters is that both women now understand how fear shaped the conflict, and neither is willing to let that fear control the final moment. Charles delivers his verdict through action rather than punishment. Nobody loses a title. Nobody is publicly humiliated. Instead, the original arrangement remains. The internal process that allowed unauthorized symbolic changes is corrected, and future ceremonial alterations require his direct approval. Camilla remains beside him. Anne leaves with her dignity restored. The king preserves his marriage while repairing the bond with his sister. The final lesson is clear. The monarchy survives this wound not by pretending it never happened, but by correcting the imbalance that caused it. Charles recognizes that loyalty must be acknowledged. Camilla understands that queenship does not require diminishing another woman's place, and Anne learns that her service has not been erased by silence. And when the photographer finally captures the portrait, the image means something entirely different from what was originally planned. It represents a family that nearly fractured over pride, position, and silence, and chose, before the shutter finally closed, to put dignity back where it belonged. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.